At 14:30 hours on an afternoon in February 1942, Major Frank Capra sat in a Pentagon screening room watching Triumph of the Will for the first time. The Leni Riefenstahl film had been made in 1934 to document the Nazi Party rally at Nuremberg. For 114 minutes, Capra watched Adolf Hitler descend through clouds like a god. He watched 200,000 Germans salute in perfect unison. He watched torchlight parades and massed formations and speeches that built to ecstatic crescendos. When the lights came up, Capra turned to his assistant and said they were dead. How could they make anything to counter this? The enemy had a 7-year head start and unlimited resources, and Riefenstahl, who was the most technically accomplished filmmaker he had ever seen. The United States had Frank Capra, who made comedies and dramas about small-town America. General George C. Marshall had told him 3 days earlier that he needed to win the battle for men's minds. Marshall would command 8 million soldiers, most of them draftees who had grown up in isolationist regions and did not understand why America was in the war. Marshall needed films to explain why. The Army Signal Corps had tried. They produced lectures that officers read to recruits. The lectures were deadly dull. Troops fell asleep. Marshall canceled them and called Capra. Capra was 44 years old. He had won 3 Academy Awards for Best Director. It happened one night in 1934. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town in 1936. You Can't Take It With You in 1938. He was the highest-paid director in Hollywood, earning over $300,000 per year. He had directed Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in 1939, which critics called the definitive statement of American democratic ideals. He was famous, wealthy, and at the peak of his career. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Capra volunteered for the Army within hours. The decision was not entirely patriotic. Capra was born Francesco Rosario Capra in Sicily in 1897. His family immigrated to Los Angeles in 1903 when he was 5 years old. They were poor. His father sold fruit from a wagon. Frank sold newspapers. Italians in California faced discrimination. They were called wops and dagos. Children threw rocks at them. Frank Capra became an American by force of will. He attended college. He served in the Army during the First World War. He became a citizen in 1920. He changed his name to Frank. He worked in film studios and eventually directed features. By 1941, he was the most successful Italian immigrant in Hollywood. But he was still an immigrant. Volunteering for the war proved he was American. Marshall interviewed him on February 11, 1942. Capra recalled the meeting in his autobiography. Marshall stood behind his desk and fixed Capra with what Capra described as the coldest stare he had ever seen. Marshall said that within months, America would have 8 million soldiers. They would be citizens in uniform, not professional soldiers. They would face German and Japanese forces that had been fighting for years. The enemy believed Americans were soft, undisciplined, and unwilling to sacrifice. Marshall needed to convince his soldiers that they could win and that the cause was worth dying for. He needed films that explained what the war was about and why democracy was worth defending. Capra asked how much time he had. Marshall replied that the first film needed to be ready in 60 days. Capra protested. 60 days was impossible. You needed scripts. You needed filming. You needed editing. Marshall stared at him. Marshall said he had never been chief of staff before either. Thousands of boys had never had their legs shot off before. Capra would learn on the job like everyone else. Capra saluted and left. He had no idea how to make a documentary. He had never made anything except Hollywood features with controlled sets and professional actors. Now he had to make a film explaining the entire war to an audience of millions using footage he did not have, and a budget the Army had not allocated. He went to the Signal Corps film library and started watching everything they had. German newsreels, British newsreels, Japanese propaganda, American news footage. Most of it was useless. Combat footage was scarce because the United States had barely entered the war. German footage was extensive because Germans had been filming everything since 1933. This gave Capra his strategy. He would use enemy footage against them. Triumph of the Will showed Nazis as powerful and unified. Capra would recontextualize the same footage to show them as mechanical and inhuman. Riefenstahl filmed thousands of Germans marching in lockstep. Capra would present that as evidence of totalitarian conformity, destroying individuality. The Nazis had made themselves look terrifying. Capra would make them look threatening but also alien. Americans watching would see the enemy as powerful but fundamentally opposed to everything Americans valued. This would create motivation. Americans would fight to prevent their country from becoming what Germany had become. The technique required voice-over narration that explained what the audience was seeing. Capra hired Walter Houston, a respected stage and film actor, to narrate. Houston's voice was authoritative without being condescending. He could deliver complex information clearly. Capra wrote scripts that alternated between factual exposition and emotional appeal. The narration described historical events. The visuals showed consequences. Maps displayed territorial conquests. Footage showed civilians fleeing bombed cities. The combination created an argument. This is what happened. This is why it matters. This is why you must fight. Disney Studios provided animation. Cartographers created animated maps showing enemy advances across Europe and Asia. The animations were simple but effective. Black arrows swept across borders. Cities fell. Countries disappeared. The visuals communicated scale and speed that statistics alone could not convey. Seeing Germany conquer France in 6 weeks made more impact than hearing that France fell on June 22nd, 1940. Music was composed specifically for the films. The Army Air Force Orchestra recorded scores that mixed patriotic themes with menacing motifs representing enemy forces. The music was manipulative deliberately. It told audiences how to feel. Triumphant music accompanied footage of American forces. Ominous music accompanied enemy footage. The technique was obvious but effective. Audiences responded emotionally before they could analyze intellectually. The first film was titled Prelude to War. It ran 53 minutes. The structure established the template for subsequent films. Part 1 explained the historical context. How did the world reach this point? Part 2 identified the enemy. Who were the Axis powers and what did they want? Part 3 explained American involvement. Why is the United States fighting? The film divided the world into 2 camps: free nations and slave nations, democracies and dictatorships. The choice was binary. America would defend freedom or tyranny would spread everywhere. Capra completed Prelude to War in May 1942. Marshall screened it privately and immediately ordered copies distributed to every Army base. Within weeks, over 1 million soldiers had seen the film. It was shown to recruits during basic training. It became mandatory viewing before deployment overseas. The response was positive. Soldiers understood the war better after watching. Morale improved. Commanders reported that troops asked intelligent questions about strategy and objectives instead of complaining about conditions. President Franklin Roosevelt saw the film in September 1942. He ordered it released to civilian theaters. This was unprecedented. Military training films were never shown publicly. But Roosevelt believed the film served a strategic purpose. American civilians were making sacrifices, rationing limited food, gasoline, and consumer goods. War bonds redirected personal savings to military spending. People needed to understand why these sacrifices mattered. Prelude to War explained it. The film played in theaters nationwide alongside newsreels and feature films. Approximately 10 million civilians saw it. Public support for the war effort increased measurably according to Office of War Information polls. The film won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1943 because metal was being conserved for military production. The Oscar was a plaque instead of the traditional statuette. Capra received the actual statuette after the war ended. The recognition validated the approach. Hollywood techniques could serve military objectives. Entertainment could educate. Propaganda did not require lies if truth was presented effectively. 6 additional films followed between 1943 and 1945. The Nazis' strike explained German expansion from 1933 to 1939. Divide and Conquer covered the fall of France and the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain detailed the air campaign from July to October 1940. The Battle of Russia covered the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1943. The Battle of China explained the Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1944. War Comes to America traced American isolationism and the path to Pearl Harbor. Each film used the same structure: historical context, enemy actions, American response. Each film made the same argument. Democracy was worth defending. The enemy was real. Victory required sacrifice. The production process was chaotic. Capra assembled a team of Hollywood professionals who enlisted or were drafted into the Signal Corps. Directors Anatoly Litvak and John Huston contributed. Editor William Hornbeck assembled raw footage into coherent narratives. Writers worked 16-hour days producing scripts that balanced information and emotion. The team operated from offices in Washington and a facility in Queens, New York. They worked under constant deadline pressure. Marshall wanted new films released every few months. Delays were unacceptable because millions of troops needed orientation before deploying. The research was extensive. Signal Corps personnel scoured archives in America and Britain for usable footage. They captured German and Japanese films from embassies that closed when war was declared. They confiscated Italian newsreels from theaters in areas with large Italian populations. They purchased Soviet documentaries through neutral intermediaries. The accumulated footage exceeded 1 million feet. Editors reviewed every frame and selected sequences that served the narrative. A 1-minute scene might require reviewing hours of raw material. The political complications were significant. The Battle of Russia presented the Soviet Union as a heroic ally resisting fascism. This required ignoring the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939, the Soviet invasion of Poland, and the occupation of the Baltic states. American audiences in 1943 needed to support the alliance with Stalin. Highlighting Soviet aggression would undermine that support. Capra presented the Soviets as victims of unprovoked attack, defending their homeland. The film showed Russian civilians resisting German occupation. It omitted Soviet political oppression and the mass deportations that occurred in occupied territories. This was propaganda, selective truth in service of strategic objectives. The Battle of China faced similar problems. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government was corrupt and militarily ineffective. Chinese forces had suffered repeated defeats, but China tied down Japanese forces that might otherwise attack American positions. American support for China was essential. The film presented Chinese resistance as heroic and Chiang as a democratic leader. It showed Chinese soldiers fighting bravely despite inferior equipment. It omitted the fact that Chiang was hoarding American supplies and avoiding combat with the Japanese while preparing to fight the communists after the war ended. These omissions troubled some of Capra's team. They argued that propaganda based on lies would backfire when soldiers discovered the truth. Capra disagreed. The films were not lies. They were selective emphasis. Every statement was factually accurate. The selection of which facts to emphasize served the objective of maintaining morale and support for Allied governments. Soldiers needed to believe their allies were worth supporting. Questioning Allied competence or motives would undermine unity. Therefore, those questions were not raised. The ethical boundary was debated internally but never publicly. Marshall reviewed every film personally before distribution. He understood the political implications. He accepted that presenting allies positively required omitting their failures. This was practical necessity. The war required unity. Unity required positive narratives. Negative narratives were true but counterproductive. Truth served strategy. Strategy required selective truth. Marshall approved the films. The scale of distribution was unprecedented. By 1945, over 85% of American military personnel had seen at least one film from the series. Over 50 million viewings occurred in military contexts. Civilian theatrical release added another 60 million viewings. Foreign distribution in Allied countries reached additional millions. The films were translated into multiple languages. British, Soviet, Chinese, and Free French forces used them for orientation. The series became the most widely viewed documentary project in history to that point. The impact on American culture was substantial. The films defined how Americans understood the war. The division of the world into free nations and slave nations became standard rhetoric. The portrayal of Axis powers as fundamentally evil justified total war and unconditional surrender policies. The emphasis on democratic values reinforced American identity as defenders of freedom. These themes persisted through the Cold War. The Why We Fight series established templates that government filmmakers used for decades. The production cost was approximately $400,000 for all 7 films. This was remarkably low. Hollywood features cost between $500,000 and $2 million. The efficiency resulted from using existing footage and minimal original filming. New material consisted primarily of maps, graphics, and staged scenes showing military equipment. Combat footage was scarce until 1944 when Signal Corps cameramen accompanied operations in Europe and the Pacific. By then, the primary films were complete. Later entries relied more on authentic battle footage. Capra's personal transformation during the project was documented by colleagues. He arrived in Washington as a Hollywood director accustomed to control and recognition. His name appeared above the title on his films. He expected similar treatment in the army. Marshall made clear this would not occur. Military projects had no individual credits. The work served institutional purposes. Capra accepted this. He wrote to his staff in early 1942, instructing them to forget their civilian egos. They were working for a common cause. Personal credit was irrelevant. Only American victory mattered. This attitude surprised his Hollywood associates. The pre-war Capra was known for protecting his reputation and insisting on creative control. The military Capra subordinated himself to institutional needs. Brigadier General Frank McCarthy, who served as Marshall's secretary, later recalled that Capra displayed no self-interest during the war. He was a team player focused entirely on mission accomplishment. This was unusual for successful directors who typically protected their prerogatives jealously. The change was strategic as well as personal. Capra understood that military organizations operated differently from Hollywood studios. In Hollywood, directors negotiated for resources and creative freedom. In the military, officers followed orders and accomplished missions with assigned resources. Capra adapted. He requested what he needed. When denied, he found alternatives. He did not argue or threaten. He accepted decisions and moved forward. This flexibility allowed him to complete projects that would have failed under rigid Hollywood production methods. The recognition came after the war. Capra received the Distinguished Service Medal in 1945 for exceptionally meritorious service. The citation stated that his films had contributed materially to American victory, thus improving morale and fostering understanding of war objectives. He was promoted to colonel before discharge. He returned to Hollywood and resumed his directing career. His post-war films included It's a Wonderful Life in 1946, which became his most famous work despite initial commercial failure. The film was nominated for 5 Academy Awards but won none. It gained cultural significance decades later through television broadcasts. The Why We Fight series was classified for years after the war. The films contained intelligence information and captured enemy footage that remained sensitive. Declassification began in the 1960s. By the 1970s, all films were released to public domain. They became teaching tools for film schools and history courses. Scholars analyzed them as examples of effective propaganda. The techniques Capra developed, using enemy footage recontextualized with narration and music, influenced documentary filmmaking permanently. The modern assessment is complex. The films were propaganda. They presented selective truth. They manipulated emotion. They oversimplified complex political situations. But they accomplished their objective. They educated millions of soldiers about the war. They maintained morale. They fostered commitment to democratic values. They contributed to Allied victory. Whether these accomplishments justified the manipulation is debated by media scholars. Some argue that propaganda for democratic purposes is acceptable. Others argue that manipulation is wrong regardless of purpose. Capra addressed this in interviews during the 1970s and 1980s. He acknowledged the films were propaganda, but defended them as honest propaganda. Every fact presented was true. The selection of which facts to emphasize served legitimate purposes. Soldiers needed to understand why they were fighting. Civilians needed to support the war effort. The films provided that understanding. Capra believed this was moral. He had used his skills to defend democracy. He had no regrets. The legacy is the demonstration that filmmaking serves strategic purposes. Visual media shapes understanding more effectively than written or spoken words. Images create emotional responses that bypass rational analysis. Music reinforces those responses. Narrative structure guides interpretation. These techniques work whether deployed for entertainment, education, or persuasion. Capra proved they could serve military objectives. The Why We Fight series established that governments could use Hollywood methods to accomplish strategic goals. This was Frank Capra's war. The Hollywood director who became an Army major who made 7 films that shaped how 50 million people understood global conflict. The immigrant from Sicily who proved his American identity by serving in 2 world wars. The artist who subordinated individual credit to institutional mission. The propagandist who believed selective truth served freedom. The filmmaker who won 3 Oscars and a Distinguished Service Medal. He made people laugh with It Happened One Night. He made them cry with It's a Wonderful Life. He made them understand why they were fighting with Why We Fight. That was his contribution. Entertainment, inspiration, and education, all deployed in service of democracy. All accomplished by a man who learned to make documentaries by watching enemy propaganda and figuring out how to turn it against them.